Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Genius Machines 2020 Virtual Summit. I'm Patrick Tucker, Technology Editor at Defense One, and it is my pleasure to begin today's one-on-one interview session with Colonel Paul P.J. Maykish of the U.S. Air Force, Senior Military Fellow at the Center for Strategic Research at the Institute for National Strategic Studies. So thank you, Colonel, or can I call you Paul?
Hi, Patrick. Feel free to call me PJ.
Okay, PJ.
Yeah.
Sure. So first, tell us a little bit about what the Center for Strategic Research at the Institute for National Strategic Studies does.
Yeah, sure. This is an institute at National Defense University that continues to think about contemporary issues in national security affairs. It generally falls under the Joint Staff J7 initiative that kind of monitors and leads the education process for senior developmental education here in DC at the National War College and at the Eisenhower School.
Okay, so taking a look at what I like to look at in my journalistic coverage, the effects of emerging technology and even consumer technology on future national security and defense affairs. And there's a lot to talk about there, but this conference, we focus on an area that is very fresh at the tip of the mind for a lot of senior military leaders and a lot of civilians, a lot of Fortune 500 CEOs and lawmakers, and that is the effects of artificial intelligence on the way we live and the way we operate in the future. And one aspect of that is, of course, great state competition between the United States, Russia, and China.
Absolutely.
So PJ, first, a little bit your thoughts on how artificial intelligence is shaping up as a driver of that competition between the United States, Russia, and China, and where are our advantages to really take advantage of in the next few years?
Patrick, that's a great question. I'm so glad that you're leading this kind of discussion. As a nation, I don't think we can talk about it enough because the future is changing quickly. In terms of the great power competition, we're developing an assessment, sort of our diagnosis of the situation, that there's basically 7 common design attributes that we need to think about with China and Russia, as international competitors, rivals. And when you look at them, you can say that each nation, perhaps variably, but you could say each nation is strategic in their thoughts about AI as one way to offset American power. So if Russia and China can get an edge, a technological edge with AI, machine learning, and associated tech, that it's just one way, an equation of ways that you can gain sort of an offset or a systemic advantage against the United States. So they're both strategic about the subject. The second thing is they're both organized about the subject, meaning they have some of their best minds in charge of the subject, and they have large-scale central government programs devoted to advancing the state of the art. The third thing you can say is that they're both invested, and by no means we're saying they're equally invested, nor that any nation can really fully calculate the full investment of each nation, as some of it may, be classified and not all out in open source. But what you can equally say is that both China and Russia have put their money behind this. It's not just aspirational. There's a resource commitment to advancing the state of the art on AI and how it applies to national security. Fourth, you could say that both leaders of each nation are determined in the sense that they've made out loud public goals, benchmarks, future visions for which they're publicly accountable. Meaning, once you go out loud with it, you're going to hold people accountable to it, generally speaking. And so, in addition to being strategic about it, organized, invested, and determined, you could also see that both countries have reasons to cooperate on this area of digital revolution technologies in ways that traditionally in history they haven't cooperated before on other subjects. So they're overcoming historical trends. They're overcoming, linguistic, other issues that are associated with their own partnership. And for some reason on digital revolution technology, it seems to be a place where they're more likely to interact with each other and compensate from each other's strengths and weaknesses. I think the sixth thing that really jumps out to me from a national security perspective is that both nations are very conceptual about the use of AI. So if you look at the whole stream that Elsa Kanaya has really brought nicely into the English language about intelligentization and the view that the idea of smart machine behavior, the new machine age, going across sort of every aspect of military operations, and then Gerasimov doctrine, specifically how AI would be used in Gerasimov doctrine and the speeding of decision cycles and decision support and superiority, is something for which the Russians are conceptual about, meaning they're not struggling with how it could be used. They're like thought leading on that. And so the seventh thing I would say is, I think just looking at open source information, it's not difficult to say that each leader of Russia and China have emotional reasons that are totally different to be vested in sort of defeating the United States on technological issues. And so in composite, while they're totally different and they can't be the same, if the United States has to design to this rivalry, you have to say what's in common. It's very easy to say they're strategic, they're organized, they're invested, they are determined, they're somewhat collaborating, they are conceptual, and they are emotional. And that's a mix of strategic factors that we need to take into consideration and regard.
So one of the things that struck me about what you just said, and that's a wonderful overview, so thank you, but you bring up the Gerasimov doctrine, and it's interpreted different ways. I know that General Votel, retired General Votel, used to talk a lot about gray zone warfare, and that strange area of conflict that falls just below the threshold of formal military engagement between two incredibly large and well put together militaries. It's that area of activity that speaks to a friction between two entities, sometimes low intensity conflict, etc. It often has to do with convincing a certain population in a certain place where U.S. Operators may be, that the U.S. operators there are not there in their interests, etc. It's all of the stuff that really falls beneath that threshold of big formal conflict. And when you were speaking right now, something that caught me is that when I talk to military leaders, they really want to reinforce to me, to the general public, that in terms of the way the military is going to conduct formal military operations in the future, they know exactly what they want AI for, they know exactly how they want it to speed up operations, they know exactly the chain of authorities that they want to have in place, so that there's a person that operates at the top of the loop, and they have in mind how AI is really going to assist in kind of conventional, hard kinetic warfare. I don't hear very much about how they want AI to help in areas that are part of that gray zone, or part of what Gerasimov in his doctrine would call that threshold just beneath formal conflict, where Russia feels like they can make the most, take the most advantage.
Yes.
So can you give me a sense of how Russia might look towards artificial intelligence to improve its chances and its operations in that gray zone? What does that look like in the years ahead? Or now, if you can provide examples.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a couple examples that jump out right away. One is, we know that Russia has a strategic history of disinformation, political warfare, and propaganda. Some of that propaganda has been aimed at separating a people from their government, or increasing the delegitimizing forms of government. I think if you look at disinformation trends, you can see where it's not too difficult to see where AI, when stacked together with other AI applications, could make their own disinformation campaigns against the United States much more effective, precise, and persistent, because computers don't sleep. So they can do this 24/7, every day, all day. Give you kinds of examples. There's of course, a science of modeling how society works, right? There's a social science devoted to this, about how do groups work, and what are the mores, folkways, and taboos of society. And so you can imagine where an AI app would help a rival model our society and find its fissures. From that, you can also see where, if you look at applications like Live Universal Awareness Map, which is a fantastic example of how AI is being used to filter out false information, but it can capture and trigger real world events from across sources, from formal to informal sources, fuse them, run them through a filter, and say, here's a trigger event that happens along that fissure. And then at a third level, of algorithm, you could see where through the use of things that OpenAI has been trying to teach the world about, like from GPT-2 and GPT-3, that algorithms can increasingly be used to replicate communications, video, text, and imagery that seem to be human. And now, in fact, you 50-50 are not able to tell the difference between whether it's a machine or it's a human that's interacting with you. So you can easily imagine just from those three examples where the ability to model fissures in our society, to actually track trigger events on that society, and then to autonomously flood the zone with false information that you can't tell whether it's human or not, again, is a way that you can continue to just try to cause chaos and havoc in the United States, if that was your intent. I think disinformation will certainly be accelerated, but this is a fantastic source on this. It was written in 2017 by Matt Chasson, who's now the director of S&T, called the MadCom Future. So if anybody hasn't intruded upon the subject of computational propaganda, that's a great place to start, the MadCom Future. I think a second way to think about this is recent news from the Department of Justice about incriminating the GRU officers in cyber attacks across the world. I think it was well laid out by the DOJ. So for those who aren't familiar with the sandworm operations or Unit 74455, just hit the news today. I think you have to take a step back and say, how will AI make cyber better? And of course, there's a full range here. At Georgetown CSET, they're working on characterizing the entire AI-enabled cyber kill chain, if you will. So it's a whole life cycle. But just to give listeners an idea of what could change, if you can imagine malware being altered with an AI application once it's on the host or in the system, so that an algorithm, which is just a list of instructions for a computer, using artificial intelligence can mutate the malware on your system and find spaces in the system to hide or forms that are less likely to be defeated once it's actually on the host and can study the host and learn from the host. Right? So already malware has a life of its own without AI. Computer network exploitation is difficult. We've had large scale attacks in the United States, from the OPM hack to the commercial industries like Sony, who have experienced large scale cyber attacks necessarily without unleashing AI. So with AI, you're able to see how that could become more precise, how you could model network and access exploitation, and then mutate forms of malware once it's on a system. It doesn't sound good, but that would enable an actor like Russia who wanted to make their cyber activities more lethal. And just a third example, in addition to disinfo and cyber, that I would offer for dialogue would be the degree to which you're able to track individuals. If you look at recent reporting in 2019 about how cell phone data can be publicly available, there was a great piece on tracking the president, on tracking Secret Service. And so that's just commercially available data that once centralized, stored, transported, and then exposed to AI algorithms can be used to find individuals and bound them in ways that are new. And it's not difficult to imagine how it could be used for forms of blackmail, about how that could be used for forms of publishing your search histories, publishing your financial information, publishing information that's typically reserved for political figures, who are maybe trading dirt on each other during elections, may come down a level off of leaders into individuals anytime a state decides that it wants to target a group of individuals for any kind of state purpose. So I would just offer those three examples of how AI is going to make gray zone activity more precise, more persistent, more effective.
So I hear what you're saying. I encounter to different degrees all of these trends all the time now, and I can easily see them accelerating. There's kind of an old joke among people that watch disinformation or cyber security on social media, is that you can sort of clock when the bots that are probably out of St. Petersburg all begin pushing something, because like it's about 9 a.m. St. Petersburg time. It's like if you look at the timestamps on some of the hacking campaigns, you begin to realize, the Mueller report, which is a great resource on this, outlines a lot of activity from these particular adversaries. And the weird thing that is reinforced to me is how these are people, and they suffer from all of the same, sort of information vulnerabilities that people suffer from. They get up, they go to work, they clock in, and then they start, mucking about. Right. And so being able to amplify that through artificial intelligence, you can see how quickly that would overwhelm the ability of journalists, fact checkers, authorities that have to speak with credibility about current threats facing the nation, how easily they could be overwhelmed by that. And you can look to all sorts of conversations that we're having online, and you can see how that's happening.
Yes.
As to the cyber thing, only very recently has Cyber Command and the NSA come forward and say, hey, for offensive operations, we have to look at being able to use artificial intelligence to achieve the same sort of overwhelming effect that we aim to achieve in kinetic operations. So we're open to talking about that, of course, following rules of engagement, et cetera. But what strikes me is that all of the things that you're talking about are certain to advance, and yet I wonder what the response is, what the appropriate response is from the US military and from policymakers. Because I don't see us having, either on a societal level in terms of policies or within the military community, I don't see us having a big conversation about what steps must be taken now to decrease the role of misinformation to affect a populace and convert their views about a reality, about how vulnerable information is at this point, regardless of the cybersecurity measures that we put in place, or how vulnerable we all are to manipulation through consistent micro-targeted messaging that has been scientifically proven to be very influential. So what needs to happen in terms of public policy that can pass, and in terms of US military investment and doctrine to better shield us from those trends?
Now, I could say that at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, there's been a discussion, even at a recent plenary session, about a modicum of what some national moves would look like just to get organized for this kind of threat. Mm-hmm. And one case, we're encouraged by the fact that we have fought disinformation before. If you look at the way we got organized for terrorist disinformation during the 9/11 sort of era, we certainly got organized to fight that. The DoD got their information warfare specialists devoted to the state of the art. We built the NCTC, and we started rolling out operations, which you could even see being sort of effective in the conflict against ISIS, right? And so the military has a lot of experience with this as a form of war, recognizing that information warfare is its own subject, its own trade, its own art, if you will. Mm-hmm. So I think that the Pentagon's position to do that, but I think when you scale it up to the nation, and when we fought these things in the past, particularly in the Cold War, there's certainly a sense that there needs to be an organization, you could call it an ops center of some kind, that builds on the lessons of building sort of the operations center at the NCTC, but it's devoted to malign information operations against the United States. So that recommendation has been made before. It's been made, for instance, in the Balfour Center strategy that came out of Harvard in 2018. They also said it looks like we need an ops center of some kind. So there are others that have thought about that. Who populates that? You could see where a JIADF model, which has been successful in our past. Today, you can imagine a really 40-plus agency, perhaps small but elite team devoted to 24/7 operations, a lot like the Digital Forensics Research Lab is at the Atlantic Council. If you're familiar with their operations, they are so good at attributing, tracking, highlighting information campaigns against the U.S. and they're in a private organization at the Atlantic Council. We can imagine what would that look like scaled into government in an ops center on a JIADF, supported with its own intelligence and information apparatus. And finally, I would just say that you can imagine that ops center, that team, with that kind of MO of thinking about defending the United States against state level activity like that, could be super empowered with technology. And I would point to a really interesting example that we've discovered at the NSCI about the State Department's technology engagement team that falls under their Global Engagement Center, the GEC. Mm-hmm. The TET, they run this something called Disinformation Cloud, where they're vetting technical solutions, many of which, a great proportion of which involve AI and ML, as ways to sort of fight AI for AI and fight app for app, and try to offer technical solutions and tools for agencies to use to fight within their sphere of influence. So you can see where the democratization of tech solutions could go to various departments for them to use for whatever their mandates are. Mm-hmm. And I think those simple things, an operations center, which has been spoken about before, a JIADF, a team-like organization that's devoted to it, because you can't go to sleep on it.
Mhm.
So it needs some sort of 24/7 watch. If an IO campaign were unleashed during our normal sleep cycles, east to west coast here, you can't wake up 6 hours later and try to contain the autonomous behavior across the whole internet. It's got to be a focused team that's elite, small, powerful, equipped with a good intelligence arm, and unleashing technology at their level, and then at lower levels of work.
So what you say, that makes a lot of sense, and I've heard different proposals for different things. There's a lot of folks that think that the Undersecretary of Defense for Special Operations, because they have kind of the most biggest chunk of that game, should be elevated, and this idea of a council makes a lot of sense. The thing that strikes me though, what you're describing sounds a little bit like it's modeled after the Cybersecurity Directorate at the NSA, which has just stood up not too long ago. And as a cybersecurity reporter, I love what they do, because they find new vulnerabilities that adversaries are exploiting, and they're really public, and they're really fast in saying, this is a vulnerability that we've just discovered. These are the characters that we see exploiting it. So just be aware, and then all of a sudden we can have a new conversation about that vulnerability. And they're very front-facing compared to the rest of the NSA, which is focused, of course, on defending critical U.S. cybersecurity networks and also tailored access operations. So the new directorate is like the front face of, here's the threats that we're seeing as a nation, here's what we do about it. I wonder how, with disinformation, how you create an entity that has the credibility of a somewhat fractured and very polarized populace, exactly the populace that lends itself to exploit by the mechanized disinformation that you mentioned. How do we create credibility around such a government entity?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes when you build a team of teams,
Mm-hmm.
just like Colin suggests in Good to Great, who's on the bus first matters a lot. And so I think anytime you're getting something off the ground like that, if you pulled in the right talent, you mentioned NSA, certainly we would be weaker if they weren't on such a team of teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you could also imagine other people on this team of teams, and just think about the work of OpenAI, for example. Use it as an example. They're exploring the front edge of this. They're thinking actively about how AI could be used. They're taking a walk on the dark side, to quote Christine Fox, and thinking about how these things could be used against us. Imagine if what they learned was also brought into, if they, private actors and research labs and academic universities that have good talent devoted to tech applied to disinfo were invited into the GIADF, either on a voluntary basis or some structured fora, where that whole organization becomes a learning organization with the thought leaders from our commercial space, our government space that has authorities to act on things, our academic space, kind of all acting as one on a team. You could imagine that once you start pulling in organizations like that and it kicks off, you could see where the legitimacy of the organization is first by almost deciding who's on the bus. And it's not hard to look across America and think of people who should be there. Mm-hmm. And involved in that. I mean, for those who are familiar and close to the disinformation subject, if you mentioned the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, mm-hmm. They have gravitas, they have results on this subject. They've studied this subject since Russia went to Ukraine easily, at least mm-hmm. seriously since then. So I think there's an easy way to look across America at its strengths and see a team of teams come together that would be devoted, elite, small, powerful, effective, organized, 24/7, mm-hmm. and friends of tech.
Mm-hmm. It sounds very hopeful, and that sounds like a thing that I would like to cover. There has to be some sort of solution to this, because it is a rapidly, exponentially growing problem. I want to turn back very quickly to this idea of great state competition and where the DoD is right now, because someone that covers this space, I do hear a lot from top line leaders with lots of stars on their chest, on their shoulders, saying we absolutely must embrace this. We must move towards these new realities at breakneck speed. Let's also embrace the ethos of Silicon Valley. Let's embrace the idea of failing, but do so cheaply and quickly. And then you take that aspiration and you're confronted with the reality of just the Defense Department IT reality right now, and how long it takes the Defense Department to buy new information technology, how much work it takes for them to engage with non-traditional players, particularly in IT. You just come up with a lot of challenges that are kind of baked into the way the Defense Department operates. And we were talking about this yesterday with Elsa and Sam. Other countries that have strict sort of top-down command and control structures don't have quite the same obstacles, but they do have sort of similar. What, to your mind, needs to change in the Defense Department in order to really embrace some of the solutions that you're talking about and rise to the challenge that you're speaking of?
I think there's two ways to think about it. I think first you can look at how the department has been evolving and the nation really as a whole. Of course, the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, all have reflected a shift in the geist of our orientation to what we regard as something we need to defend the United States, its people, and its allies against, right? So since 9/11 happened and the 9/11 era took off, you can see a conceptual shift reflected in these documents and reflected in leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that shift has been underway. I think a great hallmark of that shift also points to the second answer to your question about how does everyone organize for this. I think if you were to put a stethoscope to the Pentagon and listen to it carefully, you would see that it's already trying to adapt. You can see it through institutions kind of mimicking what the CIA did with InQtel through the creation of DIUX. And of course, DIUX has gone through these series of its own business models and how does it harvest the small and medium-sized innovation ecosystem. You can see it through the creation of the Rapid Capabilities Offices, so the Strategic Capabilities Office, and in the Air Force, the Rapid Capabilities Office. These are not shortcuts to bureaucratic process, but they're certainly changes in the ways we rapidly field advanced and elite things in our normal, sort of acquisition cycles and timelines, which have been much critiqued. And so I think you would see that adaptation in there. You would see everybody trying to shift to a software mentality away from a hardware mentality. There I'd point to the creation of Kessel Run. You see AFWorks, SoftWorks, and everyone recognizing that we're doing this. Of course, the recent elevation from the chief data officer of SOCOM to the chief data officer of the Pentagon is a great move that signals this change, this mentality about how decision advantage and information advantage is harvested in a software way across. And so I think those shifts are well underway. I think a final way to think about it is anytime that the United States as a whole, using Thucydides' old skeleton key of fear, honor, and interest, anytime that the democracy comes together and its interests align because we have a common regard of a threat, that's when we're at our finest sometimes. And otherwise you see a lot of people get up and start moving the democracy in a certain direction, if not for interest, for honor. I would point to Bob Work's attempt to start the third offset in doing that. And when he did, just to close the answer to this question, he created an organization called the Advanced Capabilities Deterrence Panel, which the NSCAI has recommended we restore in some version or some form in the department, simply because you're able to bring together the intelligence community. It was a tri-chair organization, the DoD, and the military represented by the Joint Staff, all together in one thinking, acting group that had the power of the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary moving the various forms of lock-in in the Pentagon to move to a direction. So I think we've done that before. I had a chance to wheel Harold Brown out to his car once. And this, of course, for those who aren't familiar with someone who was very central to the Brown-Perry second offset model. And when I wheeled him out, I was asking him questions that I couldn't pick up in the literature. And I asked him, sir, did you know what you were building? And he said, we most certainly knew what we were building and why we were building it, and spoke to me in one way I wish I had recorded about deterrence by denial, and knowing exactly what the rival was trying to do and simply demoing to them that we had the capability to make their highest end plans futile. And so he said, we knew what we were building. So I think that's all within us. That's not far away from us. It's all within us. And all it takes is the right mix of fear, honor, and interest, and the democracy it can do good things.
One of the other ASCI recommendations before we close that I think is very interesting is the elevation of the head of the JAIC to answerable directly to the Secretary of Defense. Why is that important?
I think it's a great segue from what we were just talking about. In the Pentagon, there's forms of what in chaos theory is called lock-in.
Mhm.
I see them as forms of duty lock-in, where there's Title X obligations, for example, to organize, train, and equip your service. And we bury those service chiefs on how well they did that. That's their job.
Mhm.
That's not their fault.
Mhm.
We pick domain experts to lead the services, to
Mhm.
go do those things, right? But there has to be something above it that's empowered. And there you find a really dynamic mix of civil leadership, right? So civilian control of the military, and whether that's CAPE over J7
Mhm.
or OSD, strategy and force development, over the joint staff as a whole, there's these dynamics that happen above the services that need some sort of organizing principle, right? So to take an organization that's changing a paradigm out of the fray of lock-in, again, and the lock-in is not wrong.
Mhm.
It's just that you have to be wise about the design of how do you solve the lock-in problems. And I think that elevating the Jake does that, right? So for the Jake to be transformational and to kind of move the paradigm of the Pentagon from a hardware to a software company, you need someone reporting to the deputy or the secretary that's above all forms of sociological lock-in in the Pentagon.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I think that that's why that move is like unto the move of recommending the resurrection of ACDP.
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting, and thank you for mentioning that, because I enjoy covering the recently created Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, and they outline a variety of modernization technology priorities, and AI is among them, among 8. But I think that the more I talk to people, the more they discuss the need to prioritize that above stuff like quantum at this moment in time, although all of those investments are important. So that jives with that, I think, very well. And also, I see more and more the Pentagon beginning to move in that direction, but perhaps not as quickly as some of us would like. But some of us are impatient for sorts of, innovation in structure. So this has been great. I feel both terrified and hopeful, which is, I think, a good way to feel about the future. I have a better sense of the opportunity window for the Defense Department and in years ahead, and for the broader government in handling these problems. And I don't usually walk away with some sense of hope after these conversations. So delightful surprise. Thank you so much, PJ. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you all for joining us.
Patrick, I want to thank you for your leadership. I want to thank you for bringing these issues together. This is how we stick together as a nation. We have to talk about these things and think about them together. So thanks to you for calling for this, and look forward to more in the future.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.